Hey guys, Nate here with another data science interview question. This one comes from Amazon and it's a really interesting question. It deals with rolling averages. So I'm going to go through two different ways to solve this problem, and then we'll talk about the pros and cons between the two different solutions. So let's get into it. But before that, if you like content like this, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks. All right, so this is the question from Amazon. It's called Revenue Over Time. The question reads, find the 3-month rolling average of total revenue from purchases given a table with users, their purchase amount, and the date purchased. Do not include returns, which are represented by negative purchase values. Output the year month in this format here, and the 3-month rolling average of revenue sorted from the earliest month to the latest month. All right, and so there's more information below here, which tells us how to actually calculate the 3-month rolling average, and that in the first 2 months, you're not going to get a true 3-month rolling average. So that's just some details that are essentially assumptions that go into the solution. So this is a hard question because it deals with the concept of rolling averages, and it has many additional requirements and restrictions in the question itself. But it's a very important question because it tests you on how to calculate a rolling average, which is a concept and something you would do very frequently as a data scientist. Okay, before we just dive into coding, let's talk about a 3-step framework that I use to answer and solve every data science question, whether it be on an interview or in my daily job. So the 3 steps in my framework is, number 1, to explore and understand the data. So either the data schema or the data values itself, ideally both. And so I'll talk more about this as we are actually solving the question itself. Number 2 is to formulate your approach. So write out the approach that you're going to take step by step in words rather than code to start off. And I'll dive into that a little bit more as I'm solving the problem. And then number 3 is to write the code. And I write it in a certain way, especially during interviews, that helps guide the interviewer through my thought process. So I'm going to explain all of that as we are solving this problem. All right. So let's start with number 1, which is explore the data, understand the data. So just now taking a look at the table itself, the table is called Amazon Purchases. And there's 3 columns here. And on an interview, we typically can't see the values in the table itself. So let's just start with looking at the fields, looking at the schema first to see if we can actually figure out what columns we're going to need. So we have user ID, created at, and purchase amount. So the purchase amount obviously is the purchase amount of the transaction of the Amazon purchase. The created at is probably the date of the transaction, right? And then the user ID is the user, the person that actually made that purchase. So what we're trying to do is find a 3-month rolling average of total revenue from purchases. So it seems that we need obviously the purchase amount to get the revenue. And then to get the 3-month rolling average, we need to understand and figure out the date or the month and year that these purchases were made. So that would be the created at field here. And we know that it's also a date time field or a date field, right? Date data type. So these assumptions is basically what I'm going to be telling the interviewer, and the interviewer would be telling me whether or not my assumptions or my thought process is correct. Right? So I don't actually need to look at the values in the data or in the table. I really just need to have an open dialogue with the interviewer to really just double check a lot of my assumptions. My last assumption here is that user ID is not necessarily important because I want to calculate the total revenue across all users and really just time bound it, a 3-month rolling average. And I don't necessarily need the user ID column in order to do that. So in my case, I'm only going to be using created at and purchase amount. So that's kind of what I mean by exploring the data and understanding the data and being able to talk and have a dialogue with the interviewer, because you have a lot of assumptions that you're making just based off of the schema and fields alone without even looking at the data. But if you are confused still, you can ask the interviewer for some example values. In this case, we can actually see the values in the table here. And so if I hit the preview button, I get the user IDs, which are integers, the created at, which is in a date data type, and then the purchase amount. And I have some of these negative values here, as you can see. And if you read the question again, it basically says that returns are represented by negative purchase values. And in our solution, we know we want to exclude that because the question tells us to do so. All right, so that's step number one, exploring the data and understanding the data. All right, so like I said in the intro, we're gonna solve this problem in two different ways, and then we'll talk about the trade-offs, the pros and cons for both solutions, all right? So the first way, we're gonna use a CTE and we're gonna use an interval function to be able to get our data structured so that we can calculate a 3-month rolling average. So with that being said, let's start with the second step in the framework, which I'm gonna call formulate the approach. Formulating the approach essentially means breaking down your solution in steps and writing out each step basically in text format, not coding at all, to then run by with the interviewer. You're basically going to be talking about your approach, writing it out, and getting it validated by the interviewer. The best thing about this is that you're getting it validated by the interviewer. So if you make a mistake, the interviewer is going to tell you you're making a mistake or you need to think about it in a different way. That allows you to basically correct your mistakes and then figure out another way of writing up the solution so that you can get it right, can get to the right answer. So this basically ensures that you're going to be on the right path before even writing a line of code. All right, so that's just a great approach to implement during an interview. Okay, so these are my steps on how to calculate a 3-month rolling average. All right, so the first step is to create a CTE with the total revenue per month. So that's pretty easy, and I'll show you how to do that once we go over the steps. The second one is to cast the column to a date data type when I'm aggregating. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. I want to filter out the negative purchase amount. So every row, I want to ensure that we are not capturing any negative values because those are considered returns. And the question itself said to basically exclude them. Once I have that CTE, I'm going to merge it twice with itself. And this is the hard part of the question, and I'll spend the most time on this. But essentially, I'm going to merge the CTE with itself twice, adding a monthly shift using the interval function to be able to organize and structure my data set so that I can easily calculate a 3-month rolling average. Then I'm going to calculate that average, and then once I get that, I'm going to order the results from earliest to latest. All right, so that's step number 2, going through that entire approach with the interviewer so they understand basically the steps I'm going to take and whether or not those steps are correct. All right, so there's no code here, which brings us to step number 3, which is to code up my solution. All right. Okay, so this is the first step to basically have a CTE where I am calculating the total revenue per month. So what I have right now, if I run the code, I don't necessarily have the total revenue by month. I have total revenue by date, right? Because there's an actual date with this month and year. And then I have the sum of all of the purchases that happened on that specific date. So I do need to transform this into a month. Right? And so the best way to do that is to essentially preserve the month and the year because we don't want to mix years. That's kind of implicit in this question where we want to have the year separated out. So the best way to do that is to use this toChar function where I'm going to use the created at date. I'm going to cast that created at column as a date. I already know that it's of a date data type, but it's really nice to always explicitly just ensure that it is a date data type. So this is a Postgres syntax here, double columns, which will cast the created at column to a date data type. And then the to char, what we're gonna do is basically just keep the year in this Y format, and then include the month as an MM format. And I'm gonna name this column month year. And so when I run this code, what you're gonna see is that now instead of the revenues as a date, it's by the year month. Now we can go to the second step here, which is to cast the column to a date data type. When I implement the toChar function, it changes it to a string. But because I want to start shifting the data to add those monthly shifts using the interval function, I am actually going to change this back to a date data type. And so one way to do that is to use a function called toDate, right? And then I have essentially this year month format here. And then I'm going to change that to a date. And in order to do that, I need to add the date. I'm just going to add the first date of each month. That will then change this string to a date. And so when I run this code here, I essentially have the year, month, and date. But because I basically grouped everything as a month first, and then added the 01, I'm still grouping everything by year month. Okay, and then turning that to a date. And this is all going to be very obvious when I start to join the tables together and shift my year month by a month and by 2 months to get that 3-month rolling average. The third step is to filter out the negative amounts. So basically what I'm trying to do is filter these out here. So that's actually pretty easy. I can just add a where clause and say, purchase amount should be greater or equal to 0. And if I run that code, I will get all positive values here. So no returns are being considered in this code. And just like what it says here, define a CTE, I'm going to finally make this into a CTE. I know it works, so the final step is to name my CTE. I'll name it revenues as this whole thing here. I'll do the indent. And just to double check, I can always do a select star from the revenues table, which is my CTE. And there you go. I have the CTE and I've done the first 3 steps. Now comes the hard part, which is to basically set up my data structure so that I can easily calculate the 3-month rolling average. So I'm going to merge the CTE with itself twice, adding a monthly shift. So what I'll do is add a join here. So I'm just going to actually call this M1 for month 1, and then add the join. It's joining itself. We're going to call this month 2, M2, on M2.month year, right? Which is the time component. And then I'm going to join it to M1, which is my original CTE, my first table, and we're going to also do year month. I'm not going to add the time shift yet because I want to show you guys what it looks like. So it's pretty self-explanatory, right? We have the month year from one table and the revenue, and then the month year from basically the same table and the month year, the revenue as well, right? So I can already actually see a mistake I made, and it's because this group by is on the created at, which is on the dates. And so what I'm going to actually do is to change this to month year, which is the aggregate, right? Which is this whole thing here instead of the created at. Now, when I run this code, we have the month year lining up and the revenues lining up, right? So yeah, that was just a small mistake I made, and I didn't actually catch it until I started running the code and double checking. Obviously, if this was on an interview and you didn't have essentially a platform that you can execute code on, hopefully the interviewer will catch it. It's not a big mistake, and so if you know the solution to your mistake, then no points, obviously would be deducted from your score, right? So it's totally fine to make mistakes as long as you catch it, or as long as the interviewer doesn't catch it, you'll be fine. But the point is here, in order to calculate a 3-month rolling average, we need to shift one of the months by 1 month back, right? And so in order to do that, what we want to do is add a time shift here. We're going to use the interval function, interval, and then we're just going to say by 1 month. Right? And so this is a very common way to shift dates or months or years, whatever interval you want. And it's something that we use all the time when coding in SQL. And so when we run this code, what you're going to get is a shift. And you can easily see the shift here where, this is February and then this is January, right? So you're already seeing a shift back by 1 month. What we need to do now is add one more join and shift that back by 2 months so that we can easily calculate a 3-month rolling average. Because what we're going to end up doing is grabbing this revenue, which is February, and this revenue, which is January. And if we go back 1 month, it might be December, and we'll calculate the revenue for that. Take the average of all 3 months, and that's your 3-month rolling average. All right, so this is what the second join looks like. We are just adding exactly the same thing by an interval by 2 months here. And then we are naming this revenue table M3 for the 3rd month. So if I run this code, you're going to get a lot of columns. We have the first month here, March, and then the revenue for March. We have February, the revenue for February, and we have January and the revenue for January. So now what we want to do is take the average, as you can see here with the next step to take, which is taking the average. And so in order to take the average, what we can do is just basically add up all the revenue months and then divide it by 3. I'm going to call this the rolling average. Run the code. What I get is essentially the rolling average here for every row. So I need to know basically what month and year this corresponds to. So all I need to do is just say M1 month year. And now if I run that code, I get the rolling average by the year and the month. So the last thing I want to do, I need the output to basically just have the year and the month, right? I don't want this 01 here. But the 01 was necessary for me to be able to shift the months back by 1 month and 2 months using the interval function here. So what I'm going to do in order to get rid of this 01, the date, I'm just going to implement basically the same thing I'm doing right here using the toChar function. So I have toChar, the month year in the format I want, and I'm going to call this column month, run the code. It just tacks off or removes the 01. If I check the solution, it says the solution failed, right? So what we have in this platform is essentially showing us what has failed and what has passed. So green is everything that has passed. This is the official solution output. And then this is my solution output here. And so everything with 3 and above has passed. What I don't have is January and February, which makes sense because if I run this code again, I only am starting in March, right? I don't have the January or February numbers. And so if I look deeper into this problem, I'm just going to do a select all. And you see the time shifts are basically starting with March here, and then it's shifting the time back to February, and then shifting the time back to January. So shifting it back 1 month and shifting it back 2 months, which means that the first month can only start in March, right? And this is why the solution fails, or it basically doesn't match the official StrataScratch solution. But I told you there are 2 solutions basically to this problem, right? This is one of the trade-offs. This is one of the trade-offs using this approach, is that if you are shifting the times manually using this interval function and joins, you're not going to be able to start at the earliest month. You're only going to be able to start basically in the third month, which is March. So the pro to that is that you are getting true 3-month rolling averages here, right? There's literally 3 months worth of data for you to then get the average. The con or the trade-off is that you're not going to get an average for February, you're not going to get an average for January. So I would ask the interviewer, does that really matter? And if the interviewer says, yeah, it really does matter, you might want to try the solution in another way. So that's what we're going to do next. So the second approach I'm going to call window functions. So we're going to use window functions to come up with the solution. The solution, again, has its pros and cons, and it's different from the first solution that I showed. It's going to have even a different output, as you're going to see. So basically, the first 3 steps are exactly the same. We just want to structure the data so that we get the total revenue per month. We want to cast the column, the date column, to a date data type. And then we're going to filter out the negative purchase amounts because we want to exclude returns, right? That was part of the question. The next step, use a window function to calculate the rolling average. So I'm going to show you how to use that and how to do that. And then the last step, obviously, is just to order the results from earliest to latest month. All right. So again, the first 3 steps are exactly the same. So we're going to have pretty much the same code. So we're going to have this toChar function with the credit at column, changing the date to year and month. And then we're going to calculate the sum of the purchase amount, which gives us total revenue. And it's going to be aggregated to a month-year grouping. So we get basically something that looks like this, right? So now, instead of a CTE, and maybe I should not have written CTE here, and we have the output, it looks good. What I'm going to now just do is, just like the last approach, I'm going to just say month year as the first column, and then I'm going to take the average of the revenue month just to get the revenue. I'll call this rolling average for now. It's not the rolling average, right? So if I try to run this code, I'm gonna get an error basically saying I need to add a group by here. But what we want to do is apply a window function, and you don't really need group bys to use a window function. So what I want to do now is finish this window function. So what I'm gonna do is add basically an over, and then order by month, year, which will give me basically a window. I get the average here, right? So what I'm doing now, I did an order by month, year. So it's basically by default going from the earliest to the latest month. And you can see January, February, March, and so on. And then it's taking the average, right? So the average for January is this number here. The average for February is this. And because it's in the window, it's taking the averages of these 2. And then when you go to basically March, it's taking the average of these 3 rows. And then when you go to April, it's taking the average of these 4 rows. And then with May, it's taking the average of basically these 5 rows. So basically the month that you're on, and then it's taking it's including all the months above, which is not what we want. It's very close, but not what we want, because we only want a 3-month rolling average, right? So for May, we really just want to take the average of this. How do we do that? Well, in order to do that, we can actually specify exactly what rows or how many rows we want to take the average of. So we can just say in this over function here, we can say rows between 2 preceding and current row. So what that means is it will calculate the average of the current row, say it's this one if we care about March, and then the 2 preceding rows, right? These 2 as well. So it's going to take the average of these 3, and that gives you the March 3-month rolling average. And then for April, it will take the average of these 3 months and it'll give you the 3-month rolling average for April, which should only include February, March, and April total revenues, right? So if I run this, what I now get is the 3-month rolling average for March, April, May, and so on. For February, we only get the 3-month rolling average of January and February, which is actually only a 2-month rolling average. And then for January, we only get the January average because we're not going back to the year 2019. We don't have that data. So if I now check this, my solution is correct because I have January and February included in my solution here. So why did I do it in 2 different ways? Well, it's really to show you that 2 different ways are possible. They come up with slightly different solutions, but both solutions are correct given the context behind the question or the business, question that you're really trying to answer. So the dialogue with the interviewer will really set the tone and really will allow you to pick the correct approach. So now let's talk about optimization. 2 different approaches. Again, we had 2 joins and an interval shift with approach number 1, and this one used a window function, right? And so the interviewer is really going to ask you at the end of the interview most of the time, how do you optimize your solution, or which one is the best solution, right? And so here we can't really get rid of the CTE. We have this for both, solution 1 and this solution, but solution 1 has 2 joins. So it's a little bit slower when it executes because you're joining. It's kind of like an extra step in the code execution versus just having a window function here. There's no join, so it's faster, and you don't get the group by also that's needed to execute like you do in solution number 1, right? So in terms of optimization, what you can do, you can't really get rid of the CTE because you need it to kind of structure your data, but the window function is faster, so it's more optimized than having 2 joins. So that's something that I would tell the interviewer because what they're trying to get at in an interview is whether you know or not SQL theory, because when you're handling and manipulating very large data sets, these things actually matter. It's a matter of being able to execute your code in a split second versus having to wait like 30 minutes for your code to execute because you're trying to join, you have 2 joins off of a table with like billions of rows. That's going to take a really long time for it to execute and do all of the joining and the grouping. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. The whole point was to stick to a 3-step framework that you could use for essentially any data science problem, whether it be on an interview or on your day job, answering it using the framework each and every time, and then understanding, several solutions to the same problem, but really trying to dive deep into the requirements of the question itself with the interviewer so that both of you guys are aligned in terms of understanding what needs to be in the output and why. And then optimization, just like we just discussed, just understanding SQL theory, understanding how to optimize your code, and understanding what code will run faster. All right, so hopefully that all made sense. If it doesn't, please leave me a question in the comments and I'll try to answer it. Thank you guys for watching. If you like content like this, again, please subscribe to this channel. I will release these types of coding questions as much as I can. All right, thank you. Bye.